May 22, 1946, Prague. A crowd of 5,000 people gathered in a courtyard, eyes locked on a single metal pole standing 10 feet tall. At the base, a Nazi war criminal named Karl Hermann Frank. He thought he knew what hanging looked like. He was wrong. What happened next wasn't the drop from a gallows you've seen in movies. It was something far stranger. And according to the executioner, more humane. But the crowd that day would disagree. To understand why Frank's execution shocked witnesses, you need to know how pole hanging actually worked. Forget everything you think you know about hanging. No gallows, no wooden beams, just one vertical pole about 10 feet tall, standing in the center of a square. The condemned person would arrive with their hands bound, a rope attached to their feet threaded through a pulley at the pole's base. Then came the strange part. A chest sling, basically a leather strap, was wrapped under their arms, and they were hoisted straight up to the top of the pole like cargo. At the peak, the executioner tied a noose around their neck, secured it to a hook at the top. Then the chest sling was released. The person dropped, but only 2 feet. That's when the executioner did something that made this method unlike any other. The executioner stood on a platform behind the condemned. As they dropped those 2 feet, he reached forward and placed the heel of his hand under the prisoner's jaw, then twisted, hard. The goal was to manually dislocate the neck, snapping the spine at the base of the skull. In theory, death came in seconds, loss of consciousness almost instantly. A 19th-century Austrian hangman swore this method was faster and more merciful than a standard gallows drop, where people could strangle for minutes. But here's the problem. It required perfect timing, perfect placement, and an executioner strong enough to break a human neck with his bare hands. When it went right, death was quick. When it went wrong, well, that's why some called it the strangling gallows. Pole hanging started in Austria-Hungary sometime in the 1700s. For over a century, it was the preferred execution method in the empire. When the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed after World War I, neighboring countries inherited the technique. Czechoslovakia adopted it, so did Hungary, and then came World War II. When the Nazis occupied these regions, thousands died in camps and prisons. But when the war ended, the tables turned. Nazi officers, collaborators, and war criminals faced trial, and many faced the pole. Karl Hermann Frank, the man from our opening, was one of the highest-ranking Nazis executed this way. He'd ordered the destruction of entire Czech villages, thousands of deaths tied to his commands. His execution was public, deliberate, a message. But Frank wasn't alone. Across Czechoslovakia and Hungary, hundreds of war criminals met the pole between 1945 and 1950. Then something unexpected happened. The communist regimes that took power after the war kept using pole hanging, but the targets changed. Political prisoners, accused traitors, people who opposed the new governments. Milada Horáková, a Czech politician who spoke out against communist rule, was arrested for treason in 1950. Her trial was a sham, the verdict predetermined. She was taken to the pole and executed in front of witnesses. She wasn't a war criminal, she was a dissenter. By the 1950s, pole hanging had transformed from a method of wartime justice into a tool of political terror. The executions moved indoors. Czechoslovakia stopped using the method in 1954, switching to more conventional hanging inside Pankratz prison. Hungary held out longer. They performed their last pole hanging in 1988, making it one of the last countries in the world to use the technique. Over 1,000 people total died this way in Czechoslovakia alone. So why didn't it spread? Why did Britain, America, and France stick with gallows? The answer is simple. Pole hanging required skill most executioners didn't have. A standard gallows drop was mechanical, predictable.
You calculated the person's weight, adjusted the rope length, and gravity did the work. Pole hanging demanded strength, timing, and precision. One wrong move, and the condemned strangled slowly in front of a crowd. That's a public relations nightmare for any government trying to appear civilized. Plus, it looked brutal. Even when it worked perfectly, the image of a hooded body jerking on a pole, held up by a rope around the feet, was harder to justify than a quick drop through a trap door. Western nations wanted executions that appeared clinical, detached. Pole hanging was too hands-on, too visceral. But for the countries that used it, that was the point. Public executions aren't just about death, they're about power, about showing a crowd what happens when you cross the state. The pole made that message impossible to ignore. Karl Hermann Frank's body hung on that pole for 30 minutes after he died. The crowd stood in silence. Some said it was justice, others called it revenge. But here's what no one talks about. In the final seconds before the chest sling released, Frank looked at the executioner, and according to one witness, he smiled. What he found funny in that moment, no one ever figured out. Maybe he knew something about the method the executioner didn't, or maybe